Hello. All right. I want to let you know that as far as that what you show on your pictures, there is a chance that it could be posted on YouTube. What the problem is with data, the amount of data. The last video I just did, the Delta system would not accept it, and so I had to put it on YouTube. So just kind of letting you know as far as your privacy. Okay. And so now I'm going to try to, well, first I'll try to get your names, and then I'm going to share the screen to show you some notes regarding this week's um, assignment. So let's see here. Let me get the names down. Oh, gotcha. Sorry, it takes me a minute. Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. And over here, yes, because 11 includes me. Okay, so once again, I want to let you know that there's a chance this can go to YouTube if the data doesn't fit. So let's go ahead. I'm going to try to share the screen here. But before I do, actually, do you have any questions or anything that to communicate with me that I need to be aware of? All right, I'll take that as a good thing. And so we'll go ahead and move on here. So we're doing the West, right? And we're focusing upon Turner's thesis of the West. All right, so what you find on number 1 is a romantic thesis, right? Frederick Jackson Turner stated that what makes America America, how he defines Americana is equality of economic and political, for that matter, but mainly economic opportunity. Equality of opportunity. All right. This goes back to the founding fathers. Another term used for it is meritocracy, right? Like to merit or earn or deserve. So meritocracy. And so he says that the West helped pave the way for us to return and fully ensconce our identity, our institutions, our culture, even our rugged individual personalities uh, into this meritocracy and make it truly embedded in who we are as Americans. All right. And he tends to put it in at least 2 categories: equality of danger and equality of opportunity. Now, remember, with the equality of danger, why would he harp on that when he's talking about equality of opportunity? He's trying to contend, right, that virtually everyone in the race of life, in the pursuit of the American dream, had the same hurdles, to jump over, had the same backpack to carry on their back, right? And then also you get into things like Joseph Campbell's notion of the hero's journey, that's found in a lot of literature and cultural writings throughout human history. Kind of nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? That uh, making it to the top is all the more laudable, praiseworthy, right? And romantic if you've gone through a lot of trials. So you see here, right? You look on number 1 for evidence of dangers along the overland trails. Accidents and disease were the most commonly reported deaths, anyway. But you had the Platte, Columbia, and Snake rivers that a lot of people drowned in. You had snow avalanches. A lot of people, it was kind of trial and error until it became publicized, the gaps in the Rocky Mountains and in the Sierra Nevada. So some people tried to traverse over them. Uh, you also have animals, right? Going back to Lewis and Clark. And of course, you have, which is drawn out of proportion, but you have Native American attacks as well. Such was the danger that people would oftentimes caravan together. If they could afford it, they would hire scouts to help lead them and make the right paths and decisions along the way. The federal government tried to help them in providing a string of forts with stores to provide necessities to the settlers, to the travelers. And not only that, but to protect them along certain areas of the overland paths, namely the Oregon and Santa Fe trails, right? So at any rate, you have Robert Stewart's expedition as given as an example of some of the tough circumstances along the overland trail. Disease, dysentery, cholera, typhoid fever, etc. Right? Supposedly anyone could get these. Everyone has to hurdle these problems. Chaotic violence in cow towns and mining towns. Look for a depiction in number one, and please remember, read all of these, okay? Even though you're just choosing one to write on. Um, the cow towns, for instance, uh, cattle had been roaming free and wild from the time of the 1540s when Coronado came up in through the Southwest. And so a lot of the cattle were not yet branded or claimed by anyone. And a couple of successive presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes, and you had Grover Cleveland, they helped facilitate this by kind of letting people call dibs on these cattle. And if they could come and round them up and bring them to the nearest train depot to be sold to the east, or it was the old Midwest. Chicago became known as the butcher town, but oftentimes to be sold to Chicago to be slaughtered and then to be sold along the East Coast, right, for food. And so, at any rate, this became a really lucrative deal. What stated in The Cattle Kingdom by Christopher Knowlton, he contends that you could oftentimes, if you couldn't wrangle a wild uh, steer, you could buy one for $4 in Texas. They were so plentiful in number, and you could sell it for over 50 in the East Coast. So the profit margin was crazy. It was a big moneymaker. And on paper, at least, this was free for anybody who was willing to live the cowboy lifestyle and go bring them on the long drive to the train depot. But however, oftentimes uh, people would find who had an entrepreneurial spirit would find a desire, a demand, a necessity, and they would try to fill that void and make money off of it. So at the nearest train depots, like the most famous one was Joseph G. McCoy's Abilene, Kansas. And he established a big yard for a stockyard for the cattle to come up to that place because it was the westernmost depot at that time to bring the cattle in. Cars just for transporting cattle, made deals with people along the east, and was not rags to riches, but was a success story. So these kind of cattle towns or cow towns like Abilene, um, they they developed a reputation for rowdiness and disorder and violence, etc. Right? Because people brought in gambling places, brothels, bars, theaters, etc. And so you have a lot of young single men who suddenly become nouveau riche when they sell a head of steer for at one point up to about $75 each. And they come upon this money, and now all these temptations are there in this cow town where the train depot is to indulge in. And similarly with the mining towns, right? When people would flood into these areas where mineral wealth was found, just quote discovered, and it would come in large numbers. But notice, right, is that the Northwest Ordinance was not methodically carried out like it had once been in many areas. This was from our founding fathers' first government, the Confederation, and it's lasted to this day, whereby there is a legal process has to be followed. If territory is bought, if it's conquered, etc., right? And so the land survey office is supposed to go and put everything in six square acre plots, so many of those to make a city, so many of those to make a county, so many of those to make a state. A certain number of people have to be present, inhabitants there in, and then they can have a general election and elect people to write a state constitution. And it cannot contradict the federal constitution in certain areas, and it has to be approved by the Senate. And so, at any rate, that methodical process wasn't carried out so well in the West. Very abruptly in the Mexican American War, all kinds of areas were taken from Mexico. Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado and Utah and Nevada, California, right? And then after that, the southern, a certain southern coast of Texas. So at any rate, this this sudden, territorial status of these areas, they didn't have city councils, mayors, sheriffs and constables, police departments, etc. And so people had to resort to vigilantism. The miners developed mining associations, miners courts, and they would try and sometimes even hang people. And none of them was legally deputized at the time of doing so. You have hanging trees up 108 here in Northern California into the Sonora Angels Camp area and some of those small towns. So at any rate, you have that going on. You have a picture underneath number one of the famous Dalton brothers. They were chased down by a group of people, largely consisting of family members of their victims in their bank robberies and etc. And they chased them down and shot and killed them and displayed their bodies for everyone to see. And so this this was, I wouldn't say the norm, but you find evidence. You could select evidence in the West of this kind of lawlessness that's often depicted to this day in Hollywood and in novels. And so at any rate, yeah, that kind of covers that part, the equality of danger, right? Then equality of opportunity. If you were quick enough on your feet to start some type of business, engage in some type of entrepreneurial pursuit, Turner's thesis states that it didn't matter if you had money prior to that. And of course, that's arguable. And so people had access from San Francisco to loans, to credit. People had access to land, um, especially by way of the Homestead Act of 1862, which granted 160 acres of free land for anyone who pledged loyalty to the Union, because they were in the midst of the Civil War, and agreed to stay upon it for a certain number of years. Um, and so you had opportunities like that. Um, at some points, the railroads jacked up the prices of their lands that were granted to them by Congress, and at other times they had it down to 2 cents an acre. And so sometimes you could find cheap, even free, available land, and then you could become a cash crop farmer, right? And grow some type of crop and sell it for profit. But back to the entrepreneurial, although that is entrepreneurial, right? Being a cash crop farmer, is one term is used is mining the miners. People like Sam Brannan from in San Francisco, who would come with a Mormon battalion into California. He just did something as simple as bought up as many pickaxes and basic mining equipment as he could, and had a monopoly on it for a short period of time, and sold it at extortionately high prices, and became very rich from having done so. The Chinese laborers and miners who came in, some of them established inns, right, or hostels. They established restaurants and laundromats and developed the reputations for those things. But the miners desired or needed those things, and they made great money off of mining the miners. Okay. And then, of course, along the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, you had commodities that people were in need of. Some people even took people's mail if they were going back to the East Coast for a certain amount of money uh, per person to bring the mail back for them to their loved ones. You had, just if you were business savvy enough, some constructed ferries across the dangerous rivers and charged people to use them, especially with big Conestoga wagons, etc. And so, if you were quick enough on your feet as a businessman or woman, things could be done. Mineral wealth in 1848, the Alta California newspaper in California and others contended that Governor Mason said that there were only about 4,000 miners in the mines in 1848 at the time, and that they were extracting over $35,000 collectively a day. Or no, I'm sorry, $13,000 a day. And that's in J.S. Holliday's The World Rushed In book. Um, so if you were there early, that was the key. The Comstock lode of Nevada, the Dakotas, where they found gold up there, in the Montana, and the list goes on and on. So if you get there soon enough, you could make a killing. And of course, you had famous bonanza kings who went from rags to riches in doing such. And so let's see here. I'm going to skip the cattle barons because we're going to get more to them in just a moment. And then labor, I gave just there's a conveniently a good statistic for Turner. Notice I don't say other railroads what they paid, other industries that what miners were paid, but conveniently, right, number one chooses to look at Union Pacific Railroad workers. And different academics today contend that it was anywhere from $300 to $400 for basic necessities, the minimal standard of living in the Gilded Age, the late 1800s that we're talking about. And the working 6 days a week, the workers for the Union Pacific made 475. So they definitely got by as far as jobs you could work. And you could work as a vaquero, a cowboy on someone's ranch, although that didn't pay very well. Uh, so at any rate, moving on, okay? Then cons is you're looking at number two, okay? As I think of the expression, it takes money to make money. And to this day, right, liberals and progressives contend that in a laissez-faire, in a let it be, let everything go as it naturally goes, no government intervention, capitalism, that it's too unfairly Darwinian, right? That some people are born inheriting their father or grandfather's wealth, and they're like a lion going against chihuahuas. And so hence a need to try to do something about that. We're going to get more into that next subject with the so-called robber barons, all right, with the Gilded Age assignment. But this happened in the West as well, whereby big corporations went public and they're able to have many commercial ties that the common man did not have and gain loans that the common man could not gain and acquire. And they also, right, had subscribers who were buying stock from all over the world, at least Europe and America. And so they could play with other people's money. So with superior capital, right, they can engage in research and development and develop machinery, for instance, that would give them a huge edge over their smaller competitors. You had the mechanical reaper and thresher and harvester combine for farmers that were wealthy corporate farmers. You had the air powered or pneumatic or water powered hydraulic drills that were as big as oil derricks, blasting into the sides of mountains. Lode mining, look up lode mining and see how intricate and expensive that was. The average person didn't stand a chance to do that. And Alan Brinkley in our textbook contends that most of the wealth that was extracted during the late 1800s came from lesser minerals than silver and gold, and came from deep within the veins of the caverns, the mountains, underground, etc. And the average person could not reach those with a pickaxe in his hand. And so most of the wealth was extracted, arguably, by wealthy corporations who had the machinery, the capital to play with to extract it. All right. And then once they do that, right, when you could harvest in 3 hours what took a farmer with hand tools 6 days, right? When you have the money to buy more acreage than he does, right, and hire more laborers to help you do it, you have a much larger quantity to sell. Not only that, you have money that you could lose momentarily. So what you do as we get into the robber barons is you just put your price lower than your smaller competitors are able to do. Because if they go down to a certain price, they lose money. They don't make any profit. And the big guys could afford to drop their prices. And then if that's not bad enough, they had the big guys had political capital. They had connections with government to grant them subsidies, right? Uh, this goes back to at least Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury under Washington's administration. And the idea was to him, right? He wanted to create an urbanized, commercialized, industrialized, and diversified economy. And in order to do that, he thought you have to make it worth people's while to engage in different industries and so forth. And he was big on infrastructure, like with communication and transportation. And so if you're willing to lay down all that money that it takes, and it was very expensive to lay track and railroads, right? Then the government was willing to help you and make it worth your while, because the argument was is what you were doing for private gain was, whether you intended it to or not, you were helping out the general welfare of the economy of the American public itself. So railroads received, oh my goodness, the Union Pacific received like 22 million acres. I have the numbers in number two from Howard Zinn's book. So the railroads were big recipients of help, right? And they were oftentimes granted subsidies with certain amount of acres of land on it on both sides of the track wherever they laid their track. And so now that land was theirs to sell. And people wanted to be near a train depot for the obvious reasons of commerce or trade. And so cities developed, property values went up, and people were wanting to be a part of all this. And so the railroads could make a lot of money selling their land to people, to the general public. And so it just didn't seem fair. And when you look at the Muscle Slough incident in Southern California, uh, people for the longest time, the colonial time period, right? They call it a safety valve thesis. Is that when you have a group of people, in this case, it was like Bacon's Rebellion in your 101 class, a group of like indentured servants who are really low on the social economic pyramid, but they have high aspirations, right? That one day they're going to join the wealthy planters. And when those aspirations are dashed, they become disillusioned and possibly rebellious. And they could be a source of anarchy or rebellion, some kind of coup within the country. So it was in the best interest of some of the royal British governors and others to just encourage them to head west and take whatever land they wanted. Okay. And it was known as squatters' rights. And so if the land is not currently inhabited, uh, or claimed by anybody else, and you stayed on it and improved it and cultivated it for a certain period of time, you could be granted anywhere from the first rights to purchase it at market price, to have to uh, have an auction and outbid your opponents, and to sometimes to get in it outright free. And so that's what happened in Southern California down at Muscle Slough. Is these squatters came there, contended no one was living on that land, and so they got a local judge to grant them squatters' rights on that land. And then before you know it, the Kansas Topeka Railroad comes in and says, okay, guys, out. This land belongs to us, right? We've been granted it as our railroad tracks are coming through here. And they said, oh no, we have evidence of the local judge granting it to us. And basically uh, the conglomerate of the railroad said, well, our authority trumps yours. You just are have that by virtue of a local judge. We have this by virtue of federal Congress. And so when the squatters refused to leave, they sent a marshal and a deputy. They shot at the marshal and deputy. Um, and then a contingent of soldiers was sent to forcibly extract them off that land. So you have class warfare in the West, just like you have it in the East. Um, you also have the big mining companies. Silicosis or miner's lung was common. Very poor substandard um, wages, right? Inhalation of fumes. You have the cave-ins and other types of accidents that could happen, back-breaking work, right? And especially like with the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, they're largely Hispanic laborers, rose in rebellion. They struck. They engaged in a strike. Anaconda tried to bring in scab workers, and violence ensued. So you have social strife and economic strife, and this notion, right, that some people are being pigeonholed into the proletariat. The proletariat is the modern industrial laboring class, right? That work with their hands. That they are being that there's somewhat of a glass ceiling for them, right? That there may not be actual rules or laws that state that that you have to pay them so much, that you have to advance up to foreman position, uh, any of your workers. So they're not technically breaking any laws, so technically, on paper, it looks as if someone could rise, but it's not really happening. And so that's known as proletarianization, and certain ethnic groups, as we get into, particularly the Asian immigrants and the Hispanics, are going to be pigeonholed into the proletariat. The second component, not only was it very tough for them to rise past the proletariat economically, de facto, in day-to-day life, but in some cases with Asians and Hispanics, they actually did go beyond a glass ceiling and create an actual legal ceiling and passing discriminatory legislation. You have the mining taxes, the miners' taxes. One was aimed primarily against the Asian migrants, immigrants, and another one was aimed against the Hispanics. Um, you have laws against um, Asians being able to purchase um, their purchase land that were passed as late as 1911 against the Japanese here in California. So notice he conveniently leaves that out of his thesis, right? This discriminatory behavior towards certain demographics, as well as the fact that there may not have been, even when you take that out of the equation, there may not have been true equality of opportunity because those already wealthy, and particularly the corporations, right, had an unfair advantage. And so going back to the Asian immigrants, right? A lot of them were came from the system of the Haole, Haole. We'll get to them, but Americans living in the Hawaiian Islands who became sugar planters, and they had a modern form of indentured servitude, um, uh, using what were called coolie laborers, COOLIE, and they would bring them in, and they were to work off the cost of feeding and clothing and providing for them, and work off their debt, and then they were to be free once that happened. But some of them were brought against their will. The colloquial term was shanghaied. And so from there, right, people like leaders of Central Pacific, like Charles Crocker, heard about this, and the Chinese had developed a reputation for working very diligently, but get this, for also being very docile. And docile, right, is very meek and humble and doing what you're told, and basically being an easily exploitable laborer. So Crocker took a chance on about 100 of them, made a bet with a gentleman from the Union Pacific as far as how many miles of track they could lay in a day, won that bet, and then it was in the newspapers, and thus developed the reputation of the Asians as being ideal laborers because they don't complain, they do what they're told, and they work very efficiently and get a lot done in a little amount of time. And so, what do you know? A lot of the big employers are going to employ divide and conquer tactics, whereby when their laborers go on strike, they bring in scab Chinese laborers who are willing to work at that lower price. And so, of course, the labor unions began excluding the Chinese and resenting them. They were called them celestials from the celestial kingdom, right? Resenting them for stealing Americans' jobs. And then, not to mention their difference in dress, their difference physiologically, right? They Americans became very xenophobic, fearful of these foreigners, and developed a reputation as seen in the press of being unassimilable, unwilling and unable, even if they wanted to assimilate, to drop their own culture and become Americans, whatever that entails. All right. And so people, there was talk of the yellow peril because a couple newspapers noted that a lot of the Chinese laborers came as single men, and some of them, in significant numbers, were marrying quote white women or Irish women, and there was a concern about that. So racism was alive and well, right? Alive and well. Um, a good book on this, as far as a combination between economic self-interest and a tradition or legacy of racism, is this book right here, "The End of the Myth" by Greg Grandin. Is interesting in talking about that cycle. And so another good book with the Asians is "Strangers from a Different Shore." Is another good book on this. So at any rate, uh, amongst the Chinese laborers, about 1,200 of them died building the Central Pacific. Many of those deaths were avoidable. They were put uh, in snow tunnels that collapsed. They were put high up on mountaintops and placed into reed baskets, and had to put sticks of dynamite along the side of the mountain, hoping that the person on top would pull the rope and pull them up quickly enough that they didn't die in the explosion. Exhaustion, hypothermia, etc., etc. So it was awful. And then going back to the Latinos or the Hispanics, right? Is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo stated that they were to be granted full citizenship rights, in particular, the right to property. But in reality, it didn't manifest itself. For one, a lot of the California and New Mexico land grants were granted by Spanish governors from the colonial period. So they didn't hold on to their paperwork. On the paperwork, the Americans were very um, anal retentive. They wanted latitude and longitude lines. They wanted signature from the governing authorities that granted that land. And if you couldn't prove that, then the judge didn't recognize it as your land. You had very nefarious lawyers that would pretend to be for them and represent them, but make them put their property or partials of their property up as collateral um, for lawyer costs, fees, right? And end up taking a large partial for their services of their lands. And then you had outright intimidation and people coming in particular in areas that were pastoral, like in New Mexico, where there were large ranches and areas of which were not fenced off. And so it didn't appear at the moment that anyone inhabited or even owned it. And so these miners at the mining gold rush era and afterward, at the end of the Mexican American War, they come flooding in and claiming stakes on little and just gobbling like moths uh, to clothing, just gobbling up little holes here and there of well-to-do Hispanic landowners. And Mariano Vallejo, that Vallejo's named after, experienced this frustration in particular. And so that was a problem. Downright ill will. We had just fought a war from 1846 to 48, the Mexican American War, that arguably was provoked by the United States under President Polk. And they had occupied Mexico City. They had taken California, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, Utah, Nevada, right, from Mexico, albeit paying them 15 million that they had offered to buy it, but after the damage was done. Um, and so at any rate, there were hard feelings, right? So then in the midst of the bit of anarchy in the mines where you have no police departments or sheriffs, people would come in and sometimes just guns and numbers prevailed. It became very Darwinian. And so people would come in, especially if they saw successful Hispanics having beaten them to the mines. There was a feeling of entitlement, like, hey, we won the war fair and square. Now this is our land and this is our gold, and you're stealing it. And so, again, this combination of racism and economic concerns, right? And so you have social banditry that happens, right? Whereby, from which we get the legend of Zorro, where people like Joaquin Murrieta, Tiburcio Vasquez, uh, oh gosh, what was the guy in New Mexico? It starts with a C. I'm sorry, his name is eluding me right now. Um, but at any rate, they would they would engage in raiding these wealthy ranches and taking their cattle, cutting through their barbed wire. Um, you even had organizations like the Gorras Blancas, the White Hats, that would try to fight in courts and through law and having people run for office to fight for Hispanic rights, to doing extra legal things, engaging in violence and stealing cattle and trying to take back land by force, etc. It's a very interesting but kind of sad, nerve-wracking subject. And so again, Turner's thesis glosses over this, right? As if Hispanics had the same opportunity that other people had. And then you always had your exceptions, right? You had certain politicians that were able in largely Hispanic areas to continually represent their people and be elected into office, right? Like Esteban Ochoa, the mayor of Tucson, Arizona. You had the Armijo family in New Mexico that did very well economically, but they also allied themselves with gringo corporations and kind of worked with them instead of against them. You had the reputation of San Antonio for having a respectable Hispanic middle class of writers and journalists and teachers and professors and politicians and so forth, right? And Southern California versus Northern California, you could see a bit of a dichotomy where there was much more um, of a resilient fight back, a push back in Southern California during the Mexican American War and after it in the Los Angeles area. So, but again, that term proletariatization, right? Iber and Leon have a book, Hispanics in the West, that they go over stats on this, where Hispanic laborers at this time began to be associated with, quote, menial jobs as cooks and cleaners, right? Criadas or maids, and as, of course, field workers, right? Beginning at this time in the late 1800s, along with the Asian, the Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and large number of Filipino immigrants as well. So let me see if I can move this down. All right, so I feel like we've covered numbers 1 through 3. All right, so with 1, it supports Turner's thesis. Equality of opportunity is what makes us who we are, and the West ensured that that happened. 2, that big money prevailed over the less fortunate, and that true equality of opportunity did not in fact exist. And three, there was ethnic um, tension and discrimination that kept, in particularly Asian and Hispanic Americans, from truly having equality of opportunity in the West. All right. So some context to number four, right? Number four, basically look for a message like America continually puts self-interest as its primary impetus in its decisions that it made, the governing authorities at every level. And oftentimes they were willing and did throw Native Americans under the bus to attain their goals. All right. And so look at some of the context here. So Native Americans from the time of Las Casas and Castillo in your 101 class, they oftentimes either stereotype Native Americans as childlike and innocent, but in a very condescending way, or as bestial savages, right? Um, then also, you look at the King Philip's War and other wars, the Powhatan Wars in Virginia, or Powhatan Wars. They the white establishments, the governments, heavily punished the Native Americans at the end of wars and took their land, and they began a precedent of that in the 1600s. And then paternalistic, like the government is your great white father, as Lewis and Clark stated of their president Jefferson when they ran across Native American tribes on their famous trek across the country. Um, so you have paternalistic things like you can't sell alcohol to the Native Americans. Native American tribes cannot sell their land without our permission. And the idea was we don't want them exploited. We're ostensibly looking after what's best for them, but we're kind of playing the tyrant, right? As this paternal figure over them. And then distrustful legislation. You could not sell arms. You could not sell guns almost anywhere in the colonial time period to Native Americans, or in some cases, there was capital punishment for doing that. And so there's plenty of evidence of a lot of distrust of natives, contingency military alliances when they didn't trust a tribe. Uh, the what ifs, in case we go to war, will you have our back, this other tribe? And you have a lot of divide and conquer tactics that were carried out in American history against Native American tribes. Then populism. To me, populism is the ugly side of democracy, right? In particular, representative democracy, whereby those who are the elected reps, they appeal to the lowest common denominator. They push people's emotional buttons, what and whom they fear, uh, what and whom they hate, what and whom they love, right? And they try to provide them what they want in return for their votes so they could hold on to their power and position. And so you see this in Andrew Jackson's time period, especially going back to the 1830s, whereby the white people, the population in Georgia and the Carolinas, they wanted tribal lands. And so they answered that in issuing eminent domain laws. So like today, right, if they are to build a hospital, a public school, an interstate freeway or highway. The government can make you sell your land to them if you're on that area, right? For the betterment of the general welfare. That's what they did here, supposedly for the betterment of the general welfare, force Native Americans to sell their lands. Well, the Supreme Court defended the Native Americans in the Worcester case. And Andrew Jackson, as president, defied that decision and made them move nonetheless. And he cited the McIntosh case, very paternalistic, saying Native Americans are not subject to the states. They're a nation within the nation separately, but they are the wards of the federal government. And remember, if you're the ward of the state, that's like orphans, those who have been committed psychologically, prison inmates. So a very kind of, powered state to be in, according to this McIntosh case decision. But the president and Congress, right, said, hey, we have a popular mandate. This is what the majority want. This is what we're going to give them. So at any rate, in the 1850s and 60s, when federal treaties did grant Native Americans certain lands, certain states just absolutely defied it. So Texas defied the Council Springs Treaty. Oregon and California defied treaties as well. And then when a war broke out between the federal government and the Sioux tribe in Minnesota, the Cheyenne were technically their allies. But the Cheyenne had sent a leader to the governor of Colorado. The governor of Colorado assured him that the Cheyenne, as long as they reported in or near the fort, they wouldn't be seen as allies to their enemy and wouldn't be attacked. Well, they did just as they were told at a place called Sand Creek, and they were slaughtered by Colonel Shivington and his men. And so sometimes, right, governors took things into their own hands and acted very ugly in promoting conflict. Then also a constitutional issue. The Fifth and 14th Amendment state that the federal government is responsible for protecting our rights to our property, our life, liberty, and property. So, Americans, what happens when you've granted land to natives in a certain territory, but Americans defy that ordinance and they pass through? Granted, in some of them, the federal government muscled that clause in and said there is a right of passage, at least, for white Americans to come through your territory, but they got to keep moving and can't settle, right? And so when people come in, inevitably in large numbers, they began killing the buffalo and messing up the resources, right? And the culture and the way of life of some of these plains natives. They struck out against the white intruders. So then the press would run with it, right? And say, oh, the quote, Indians have broken their word from the treaty and allowed safe passage, right? And so that started the development of military forts. The most famous was the Bozeman Trail along the northern plains. And the native tribes were split over this, particularly the Sioux. And oftentimes they split in lines of young versus old. The elders historically seem to have been more statistically likely to capitulate, to give in to American federal demands, whether it be allowing people to pass through, whether it be reporting to their reservation certain times of the year, or whether it be amending or changing the previous treaty. And of course, that was always promoted and pushed by the federal government when it was pursuing its own ends. And oftentimes those ends were at the expense of the self-interest of the Native Americans. And so a lot of the younger representatives, right, said, no, we're not okay with this. We're not reporting to the reservations when we're told to. We never signed the treaty and approved of it, right? There was literally a term in multiple dialects that basically translate as touching the white man's pen. And you were seen to be a traitor to your Native American people if you were willing to touch the white man's pen, because he was always out to take advantage, they thought, of Native Americans. So a lot of the youth literally split with the elders and said, no, we're not abiding by these ordinances, right? And so along the Bozeman Trail, they began to attack these forts, saying that they never gave their permission for soldiers to come in as a menacing presence in their territory. They were led by a guy named Red Cloud, and then a young man named Crazy Horse. So at any rate, violence ensued literally over a cow. That's how something innocuous could escalate. And Mr. Grattan and his men were killed. Mr. Fetterman came in to punish them, and Fetterman and his 100 men were killed. And then at that point, war broke out from this Bozeman Trail drama with the Sioux a second time, as opposed to the earlier one that started in Minnesota. Then also the reservation system, right? So the antebellum reformers, they actually had good intentions initially with the reservation system. They thought it was for the betterment of Native Americans to engage in this, for them to assimilate, right? And because the notion was, right, through the Jacksonian era, through the 1800s, is that the Native Americans were archaic. They're from a bygone Stone Age, and that if they continued to be such, the Americans, by their sheer numbers, by their alleged and self-proclaimed enterprise, were going to leave them behind, and they were going to become extinct as dinosaurs. So that supposedly it was for their benefit to become Christian, take on English names, um, start a business or a farm, and become private property owning citizens someday, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but then, right, there were always there was always an element of coercion. So the Trade and Intercourse Act by Congress stated that the um, the federal government could intervene in tribal affairs on their reservations, because remember, they're a nation within the nation, when it comes to economic self-interest. And so that's going to be exploited time and time again. I think of the Kiowa being granted Kansas in perpetuity, the statement said, forever, right? Forever ended up being 2 years, because then they decided they wanted to build a transcontinental railroad. So the federal government made them switch the terms, right? So the American government did, from time to time, go back on its word with the native tribes. Um, let's see here. So when they could not get the legitimate chiefs to sign a treaty that was in the U.S.'s best interest, what did they oftentimes do? Is I'm sorry, I blanked out. They arbitrarily bought, pretty much. They offered kind of quid pro quo. You do something for me, I'll do something for you. They gave offers to non-chief tribal members to sign the treaties instead. And the euphemism was treaty chiefs, because they were not really chiefs. And so this happened as well. So we already talked about the Sioux raid in Minnesota. They were angry because they were not getting their annuities, their annual supply of things that were promised them, because the forts became notorious, reservations, for their corruption and ineptitude. And so they were frustrated, went out to hunt, and then attacked and killed a handful of white inhabitants on their way back to the reservation. And it began a war. They were split over the Laramie Treaty of 1851 and 1868. It was supposed to initially hold them above the Platte River, but they claimed that they conquered land beneath the Platte River, and the Americans had claimed land for over a century by virtue of conquest. So why couldn't they do the same? And then the one of 1868, right, is gold was discovered in the Black Hills of the Dakotas. And that was supposed to be theirs once again, as long as the green grass grows, it stated, in perpetuity, forever. Well, when the gold was found, what do you know? The United States government wants to amend the treaty to allow the miners to come in there and mine safely, etc. And the Sioux took exception to that, obviously. And so in comes a, let's see here. I want to see how far it goes down. This is all I have, huh? So I'm trying to find where, George Armstrong Custer. So then what begins to happen, right, is you have a new leader, and leaders matter, right, in the military in particular, because they're given latitude by the presidents. Philip Sheridan is infamously quoted for having said something like the following: "The only good Indian I ever knew was a dead Indian." All right. And so, just as emblematic of his intolerance toward Native Americans, right, and his militant attitude toward them. And so he began making the demand a very simplistic ultimatum that was, of course, seen as unfair to the Native Americans. You are to abide by these new treaties, whether you sign it, whether you're present, whether you like it or not. And if you do not, and if you're not on your reservations during times of war or a certain season of the year, then we will consider you a belligerent. And a belligerent is literally like you have declared war, you're legally fighting battles in a declared war, and the belligerent is wearing a uniform, carrying a gun against you. So they could shoot you down on the spot. So a lot of young, in particular, Sioux and Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors uh, rallied under Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and said, "We're not reporting to our reservations." And so, from Sheridan's order, George Armstrong Custer became a martyr to the American public. And his story oftentimes reads as like a Greek story of hubris, right? Of arrogance and pride that are so excessive that they blind you to realities that you're living in. He had only 600 men to begin with, and he split them up into three. The man with a large ordnance, right, like the cannon, etc. He kept back. His name was Benteen. He kept him back because he didn't want Benteen to share in the glory. He had a personal discord with him, so he really could have used that, and he deliberately left it behind. Then he ordered Marcus Reno to attack the bottom of what's known as Little Bighorn, right, in Montana, where there was a large cluster of these, quote, defiant natives. Uh, uh, Marcus Reno was repulsed in bloody fashion. And Custer and his men went up to the north of the village because supposedly such was his arrogance that Marcus Reno clearly was going to prevail. He was going to chase the natives out of the village, and he was going to clean them up with his small number of men. Instead, right, over 2,000 warriors descended upon him and his fewer than 100 men, and they were all killed, including himself, in minutes. And it went all throughout the press, and there was a demand for justice against the hated Sioux, right? And then the same thing, similar things happened down in the Southwest. Cochise and Geronimo of the Chiricahua Apache tribe, they refused to go to their, it was called Bosque Redondo, right? Like round forest in Spanish. That was the name of the reservation they were supposed to report to, and they refused to. And James Carleton fought ruthlessly in another manner. He burnt all of their resources and destroyed all their resources. So as they were in hiding and trying to engage in guerrilla warfare, um, he just simply starved them into submission by the 1880s, and it worked. And then as kind of the coup de grace that finished it all off in this sad narrative for Native Americans is in the 1890s. It was called the Ghost Dance, and it became popular amongst the Sioux and other tribal members that were forced onto a reservation. And in the dance, they were contending that their gods were going to kick the white man out, wipe them out with disease. Then they would have their armed rebellion. And it so frightened the authorities, right, that they came in one morning in the midst of, them doing this dance, but most of the natives were unarmed, and most of the warriors were out hunting, and they killed 105 women and children and 28 elderly men and women in cold blood. And so that was known as Wounded Knee Massacre. The massacre or battle, it was not a battle, it was a massacre at Wounded Knee. All right, so are there any questions about any of the four numbers?
Not that I can think of.
Okay, okay, thank you. Okay, note what I'm working on is correcting your paper, your first paper, before you have to turn in the second one. So you could see what I have written about your first one as far as just, gaining familiarity with what my subjective standards are. All right.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that.
Yeah, so I will definitely do that. I apologize. I've done my other few classes. I didn't choose you last for any, it was absolutely arbitrary. Um, But yeah, I'll get on that. Okay. Okay, so if that's it, you guys, I'm gonna go ahead and call it a week, call it a day. Remember, like always, it's due Sunday evening by midnight. So please be sure to read all four, even though you only have to evaluate and analyze one of them of your choosing. Okay,
Thank you
Okay,
so
thank you.
much.
thank you. I appreciate you guys, and you guys
Appreciate you.
you'll get your extra credit for sure.
Thank you.
Have a good week.
Thank you.
Yay.
Too. Thank you. Bye bye. Angela. I can't end it.